The greatest glory in living lies not in never falling, but in rising every time we fall.
Welcome, everyone. Sidney St. James again with part 2 of growing up in a small town. This may seem a little funny, but it was the simple things of growing up in a small town I just grew to appreciate about my alma mater, Eagle Lake High School. I loved when the sunset turned the sky into a canvas of pinks and purples. I was excited when local events like the Crawfish Festival or the Rotary or the Lions Fair had their annual parades. And I smiled when the cashier at the grocery store was friendly, asking how my family was doing and if I had a chance to try the new restaurant that had just opened out on Highway 90. However, when it was finally time for me to pack up and move away, I felt an overwhelming sadness about leaving. It was weird to graduate high school and say goodbye to my classmates, who I quite literally grew up with. I dreaded every goodbye, no matter who I was saying it to. Although both the front and back of my High School Eagle Yearbook had signatures for almost every one of my classmates. And I didn't understand why I felt so uneasy about leaving for the longest time. But now I realized that I felt emotionally confused because I had planted such strong roots in the town where everyone knew my name. I knew that no matter where I lived next, Eagle Lake would always be the town I would call home. So, without further ado, let's get on with the final episode, the final chapter in growing up in a small town, and stay tuned for the conclusion, which is all the many responses I got from people, and we'll lay them out for you to hear their memories on my broadcast. So again, thanks for joining me, and let's get underway with the main story, the final chapter of growing up in a small town. Situated in rural Texas's flat-lying green fields, my hometown had more cows than people amid massive expanses of farmland. I moved away after graduation, and I haven't been back there in nearly a decade. But I can guarantee that if I showed up today, I'd be heartily greeted by not only my first name, but my middle name too. By many of the same familiar faces from my childhood, although there are not so many still there today. They'd all know what I'd been up to because small towns have a way of keeping tabs on their own, even without the benefit of social media during the time that I grew up. That's just how small towns work. You can move thousands of miles away, and they can still tell you when you last went to the bathroom. No matter which dot on the map you're from in these here United States of America, there are a few universal truths that only people from tiny towns really understand. I've talked about some on my earlier broadcast in part 1 of growing up in a small town, and now I will speak of others. All of my classmates when I grew up knew my grandparents. They knew my parents. They knew my full name, my first, my middle, and my last. And they knew my business. Oh, my middle name was given after my father, Elmer Struce. It wasn't uncommon to be shouted at as Sidney Elmer, or my friend who was center on the football team, Terry Michael, or the tackle, Billy Lloyd, or his girlfriend back then, who's his wife now, Judy Fay. And yes, even at my class reunion a few years ago, I called one of my friends Janie Lou. Oh, you won't believe this. She very quickly said, "Everyone calls me Janie." All I can say is I started laughing and said, "Okay, Janie Lou." And second, everybody knew all the crap my brothers did and judged me for it. When I say everybody, let me give you an example. Only an hour and a half away down the road from my hometown is College Station, Texas. Of course, it's the home of the Fighting Texas Aggies. This is home to what was once Texas A&M College, a much bigger place now called Texas A&M University. I went to school there for 4 years, and when I graduated, my baby brother Warren checked into his dormitory. Now you have to understand, it's still a big university, not as big as today, but anyhow, he's checked into his dormitory. This now brings me to knowing everybody's crap, right? He checked into the dorm room at Milner Hall, got all the stuff put up, turned, looked up at the windowsill in the room that he was in, and saw his last name written in ink, followed by Sidney Sucks. So, on his first day in college, he was beginning to fall prey to the Sidney Sucks and had to answer for it for a very long time, 3 semesters before changing dormitories finally. Another thing that happens when we were growing up is we get stuck behind a tractor or a combine on our way to Eagle Lake High School. That's not the only time we would see a combine with its wide table in front on the asphalt roads to the school. We would later look out the window from the high school and it would be parked on the edge of the campus. And either Davis Waddell or William Bruner would be climbing down out of it. At school, mind you. That's right, at school. But that's growing up in a small town, right? All the buildings are old. I don't know how many have been to Eagle Lake, Texas before, but the buildings were old when I was there, and they're very old now. But anyhow, all the buildings are old on Main Street, and it's actually called Main Street. You would be able to count the number of traffic lights on one hand, if there were any at all. But in the case of my town, there was only one. And even though it turned red and was blinking at midnight when we were coming in from Riverside Hall in East Bernard from a dance from the Triumphs or the Traits, not another car was in sight. But don't creep through that light, because Bill Chavis, who was the night watchman back then, would be watching. And sure as I'm sitting here right now talking to you on this podcast, he would write you a ticket. He didn't realize I would be late for my curfew getting home, so it didn't make him any difference anyhow. I still got a ticket. How about that main watering hole in our town? On the other end of Main Street, before you head out to Senior Bridge, it's called the Dairy Delight. It was called the Dairy Delight when I was very young, and it's still called Dairy Delight today. I remember, as if it was just yesterday, Louisa Colaffel was there with Francis Hinks. and they wanted to make a tour around town over and over and listen to the radio. Back then, only a story my brother Warren can tell. I lost my antenna. So you'll have to get a hold of him sometime, because I won't tell that part of the story in this podcast. But when the girls got in, we tuned the radio back and forth, trying to get it to bring in KTSA radio. We couldn't do it. I got out, I opened my trunk, and I don't know why, but there was one of those metal clothes hangers in the back, so I bent it in half and pushed it down into my broken antenna on my 54 Ford. It looked like the dickens, but Louisa reached over, she turned the knob, and bingo! KTSA AM radio came in loud and clear.
Ladies and gentlemen, the Righteous Brothers. You know, I know you've been asked this maybe 1,000 times, but I've got to ask it. How did you get the name Righteous Brothers?
Well, in the beginning, when we started singing together, we thought of using a combination of Hatfield and Medley. And
oh, that's the two names.
Hatfield, that's Medley, the skinny one. And all we came up with, well, we had the Hatleys and the Medfields, and that didn't.
And Bob and Bill really didn't knock a lot of people out.
So we worked in a club down south, and after our first show, some guy stood up and yelled out, "That's Righteous, brother," and we've been known as that ever since.
Hey, that's cool. You know, my brothers and I, when we first started singing together, we needed a name, and a fella in the audience yelled out at us, but we couldn't use it. I mean, the Get Lost Brothers? Why not? Oh, you know what? I was going to say, why didn't you do something else, another song, but the one I really would like to hear you do is Unchained Melody. Great song. Why don't you do it?
I'd do that one by myself, you know.
How come?
I didn't think it was going to be a hit.
What do you usually do when he's singing?
Find a little corner and kick myself a lot.
Come on, I'll show you the corner I use whenever I hear Tony Bennett sing San Francisco.
Boy, doesn't that song bring back some memories? Do you remember where you were when that song was playing on the radio? I bet you do. Well, in continuing, we could reach any of our friends in our mail system in town and address the envelope with their names and Eagle Lake on it, and that's it. And it would still reach them with no problem because the mail carrier knew precisely where you lived. And even if it accidentally got pitched into the wrong mailbox, the recipient knew where you lived. Amazing, right? And we saw our teachers everywhere outside of school, at the store, at church, everywhere. Even on Saturday morning after the Friday night football game, you see people that you know at Johnny's Barbershop, a one barbershop town for quite some time. You also knew where each of these teachers lived, which actually made it easier to toilet paper their houses after an especially unfair pop quiz. But I went to school with Kathy Scott, and I knew exactly where her dad lived, but I wouldn't dare paper that tree. Yet, one night, a tree in his front yard got papered, but I know nothing about it. Not that I was ever involved in anything like that, but maybe Tony Contreras or Terry Landry, now I wouldn't put it past them, that's for sure. Well, there was only one store, so you either had to deal with whatever subpar selection they had to offer or make an inconvenient trek out of town 16 miles to Columbus and get any variety. At least half of the guys in town had their first job in Eagle Lake as far as hauling hay, and at least half of those actually got pulled out of school to help during the hay cutting season. The job prepared us guys for the heat we would have when two-a-days for football practice would start in the middle of August, in the hottest time of the year, and we'd still get out there and play football twice every day. In the morning when grass had dew all on it, but it was so humid. Oh, I still remember those days. And it was the same for summer school, when the rice farmers would pull us out to drive a combine or an auger cart. High school parties were held in a field or under a bridge between Eagle Lake and Wallace. Other times, we could find a party out at Timon's Barn, just out past Senior Bridge. Then, there were sometimes bonfires fueled by cow poop out by Luna Lakes outside of town, home of many of us who found the nerve to go skinny dipping for the first time. Gosh, that was almost as hard as trying to hold a girl's hand back then for the first time. Chances are, we'd get one of the older brother or sister's used textbooks in school, or maybe even one of our parents. And then we would check it out from Mrs. Causey at the library, a book that our dad or mom checked out back in the 1940s. Oh, don't forget, you would accidentally dial the wrong number and get stuck talking to your grandma's best friend about her knee replacement because she recognized your voice. Let's talk about food delivery. Well, my friend, this was not of that time. It just simply didn't happen. But the milkman would come twice a week and leave bottles of milk on your back steps. And yes, that familiar sound of bottles clanking together said the milkman had made his delivery. Another thing we could do, can't do it today, but we could take our parents' blank check into the gifts of distinction, or over to Helen's Flower Basket, or down the main street to Albert's Variety Store and have no problem paying for whatever, or even charging something, because the store owners knew they were good for it. I still remember down at Spallinger's Hardware, walking in, getting something, and shouting out, "Put that on my dad's account." Or even down at Duncan & Son, or Parker's 5 and Dime. It worked all the time. Commercials on television were always a huge tease because they were advertising places you'd have to drive 100 miles to get to. And the shopping at the mall was not a happening thing when you grew up in Eagle Lake. But 20 minutes away was Columbus, and they had a handful of stores that were different than those in Eagle Lake. In Eagle Lake, we had Epps Cafe, Campbell's, and one of the others that slips my mind as I talk, and I'm sure as you listen to this podcast today, you remember it. It was just out past Campbell's. There were 2 of them. And then there's a rare trip, now this is rare, to fancy restaurants like the San Jacinto Inn, which was a 2-hour drive, and we totally dressed up in our finest to go there. It was near Pasadena. There was also at least one yearly festival at the Lions Club Fair in Garwood, Texas, a town less than half the size of Eagle Lake, where the town practically shut down and everyone attended the parade. And there were events like cakewalks and queen contest and cow chip bingo games. It had it all. And when people asked where I was from as I got older and went to work in the working world in Houston, Texas, it was no use whatsoever saying the name of my tiny hometown of Eagle Lake, because no one ever knew where it was. So what we'd say is, we live about 50 miles southwest of Houston. Not we're from Eagle Lake. And my house and my car, they were always unlocked, and you could throw your bike down in the front yard with little to no risk of ever getting stolen. And you could ride that bike all over town, like to the opposite side of town, without your parents worrying about where you were. On one such bike ride, I was on my 2-seater bicycle with Jennifer Bauer. Now Jennifer and I, we rode all the way out the road, out to the end of town, and then we went on out further, the wind in our face, which made it harder to pump the bike, and got to Senior Bridge. This was, of course, before the 2 of us were old enough to have a driver's license. And yes, before we got back to town, I saw my dad on the streets, and he asked me if I had a date with Jennifer. Can you imagine that? Well, you probably can't, unless you grew up in a small town. Yep, he could easily be one of the many busybodies. Furthermore, if you got up to no good, your parents would know it before you made it back home, thanks to all these local busybodies. Yeah, growing up in a small town, we knew every single person in our class, in our entire school, actually, and are still flabbergasted to this very day when we meet someone who graduated with hundreds, if not more, of other people in their classes. The dating pool in Eagle Lake High School was always so shallow that it was hard to avoid dating your best friend's ex, or your ex's best friend. Going to prom with someone not from your school was something that would make my day. It just so happened to happen one time when Cindy Ingram from Deer Park High School came into town for the weekend, and she was my date. Oh, she came from the big city, right? Not one friend in my tiny little school knew who she was and couldn't say a word one. Or if they did, they were just blowing the smoke. High school sports. Now that's something we can talk about. That was the business. see my podcast about the consolidation of high schools from Season 2. The entire town rallied around them for the big games, even if you really weren't even into sports. Chances are you still hung out at more than a few games because, heck, that's where everybody else was, especially on Friday nights. You might be in the parking lot learning how to kiss, or on the football field listening to the crowd roar when you intercepted the ball or scored a touchdown. The authority figures in our small little town were all multitasking. Our town police chief was also the fire chief and a school bus driver. And our science teacher was the basketball coach and a house painter, all on the weekends and all summer long. Or one was the minister for the Church of Christ. How many remember Coach Kenneth Newby? You didn't really get exposed to too much exotic cuisine or cultural diversity until you grew up and moved somewhere much bigger. And the three main restaurants in town were always packed on Sundays after church. One was Epps Cafe, and another was Campbell's restaurant out on Alternate 90, a mile outside of town. Oh, and yes, let's not forget the White House Cafe, which is also sub for the midnight Greyhound bus stop. If your car broke down on the side of the road at night, or if you needed to hitch a ride somewhere, someone would always offer to help. And it was always safe because you knew exactly who they were and vice versa. Or at the very least, you could just walk wherever you were heading. Our school offered only one foreign language class, and that was Spanish. 0 cool electives like culinary arts or drama, and hardly any extracurricular activities except for Future Farmers of America, Future Homemakers of America. But, we did have clubs that were drama, poetry interpretation, photography, and even the science club. We were lucky. Our town had something else to do, like Boy Scouts, and Girl Scouts, or 4-H, or if you were younger, the Brownies, or the Cub Scouts. I remember that Billy Lloyd Walker's mother was a Den Scout master, or whatever it was called. I may have that partially wrong, but I still have my Cub Scout books and merit badges from way back when. And if you were nominated for your school's student council, or for the homecoming queen or the homecoming king, or prom royalty of some sort, whoever it was would likely run against one of our friends. Nothing, and I mean nothing, was open past 6 or 7 o'clock in the evening. Not that there were many businesses anyway, but still. When most of us finally got old enough to move away, we realized just how insulated from the real world we've been. And we would really try hard not to look like a total hick. And lastly, people from bigger cities look at you in complete and absolute disbelief when you tell them any of the things I've discussed today. It really happened like that. There were good times and good things and bad things about growing up in a small community, but I tend to see more of the good as I get older. As a teenager, I couldn't wait to escape it. Look out, big city, 'cause here I was coming, right? And although I'm glad I was able to move away and explore, there's just something nostalgic about the way nothing ever really changes much. Maybe a bit more grandeur, but not really different. Like the way my little town has my back, no matter how long it's been. And if the big world ever kicked my butt, I could always go home. Of course, that's not really true much longer, but for the decades after leaving, it was very true. I'm not writing this to talk about the beauty of my small hometown, the great vacation spot it is, or what some would call lack of excitement in the winter. Instead, I'm producing this podcast today to say that on days like this, I am reminded that I am the person I am today, not just because I had great parents, but because of the community I was raised in. Community is defined by the Webster's Dictionary as a group of people with common characteristics or interests living together within a larger society. For me, the community is more than how it is defined. It is the values that we live by. It is a sense of family with no biological relation. It is gathering together not only in times of celebration and despair, but in support of each other. Just simply knowing that someone is there for you in a moment of need. Whether to lend a helping hand or simply remind you of how much greatness you have inside of you. The community I'm talking about was instilled in my peers and me at a very, very young age. We went to school together. We went to church together. And we were in class and on the field trips together. And some of our parents were coaches. Others cheered us on from the sideline. Some of our parents were the principal, or the science teacher, or the head coach of the football team. We had strict game day rituals, gathering places, and traditions, but we would battle each other out when it came time to show our school spirit and gather together to beat our rival towns. One of the unique treasures of growing up in my little small town is that many of my classmates' parents were our teachers. They had knowledge beyond their years in our academic realm, and they personally knew us and knew our story and could recognize the greatness within each of us. Of course, I'm not saying that every teacher was great, but we could almost all agree on those that made us feel we mattered and encouraged us to succeed, helping shape us into the adults we are today. We all make our own choices in life, each traveling different paths, and many of us now living many miles apart and facing our own struggles. But yet, we are tied together by the community we were raised in. We would briefly see our classmates when we returned home for a visit as we walked through the grocery store aisles. Sometimes seeing their parents instead was just as great of an experience. Some are fortunate to still live in our small town, and their children get to share in our little community. Where I grew up, we were a family bonded by nothing more than a community created by ordinary people who wanted their children to grow and thrive surrounded by love. I want the generations that created my community in my hometown to know that they've succeeded in making future generations of affluent adults. The greatness of these adults is not to be measured by the amount of money that we have or the fame that we found, but by the continued love and support and commitment that we exemplify in our own communities. I saw this commitment to community play out when two of my schoolmates banded together to pay it forward and help one of our fellow alumni and his family come together again. For all of the bad that social media can create in this world, there is much, much good And that, my friend, was a good day. Finally, a family is back together. But today's journey doesn't stop for them. It is a long and winding road, and it can all be more robust than just one. Whoa. What's that? I'm almost out of time here for today. I still have time for my conclusion, but I forgot to give my sponsor a little credit. So it's only 30 seconds. I'll run my sponsor's slot real quick here, and I'll be back with you for the conclusion of growing up in a small town. Have you heard about Anchor.fm by Spotify? It's the easiest way to make a podcast with everything you need all in one place. Yep, Anchor has the tools that will allow you to record and edit your podcast right from your phone or your computer. And best of all, Anchor is totally free. Download the Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started. Well, we're here with the conclusion, as I promised you when we started our broadcast today. All from the part one and some of the other consolidation podcasts that I did, I had a lot of folks respond to me. And so what I'm going to do is just pretty much go back to my voicemail or to my podcast on Facebook, and I'll let you know which ones they were and who had a comment. Maybe their comments will also strike more memory chords for you. Bill Beisel. He said, Sid, what about getting drunk under a bridge between Eagle Lake and Wallace? I don't know how many remember that, but there's a bridge out there over some little small creek or river. I forget the name of it. But anyhow, like a small Brazos River or something. But anyhow, it was all sandy under there. And we would go out there and we would take kegs and build a big fire and just have a good old party. Yep, I remember that, Bill. And then he said, oh, I remembered that we had fun. Well, of course we had fun. And then there's Marilyn Morgan. Diane and her said that they just loved the broadcast for part one, Eagle Lake High School, Gone but Not Forgotten. And then Marilyn Morgan said, it's been a long time since I've heard anything from you, Bill. And she's talking about Bill Beisel, so the two of them met during this podcast, since they've met for the longest period of time gone by. And then there's, let's see who else we got here. Yes, Marilyn said, and this is Marilyn Morgan, a few years older I am, that's for sure. I just went to my 50th class reunion last year and had a whole lot of fun. And Carol Konishek. Carol was my buddy's, Russell Konishek's older sister, and she said yes to all three of what they said. And then there was Louise Hamilton. And Louise said, we moved to Eagle Lake in 1958, and I was 11 years old. I count myself blessed to have grown up and lived there for several years. I worked at the Rice Theater from 1959 to 1963. And the Johnson family, well, they saved me. I loved them then, and I love them now. The people of Eagle Lake are the salt of the earth. And then there's Loretta Kretschmeyer. Well, here's what Loretta had to say. Yes, I remember Epps, and I remember all the other ones, plus some of the other things that's not listed. I wonder what those might be. And then she talked about the old buildings, and she remembers the old bank down on Main Street. How many of y'all remember that? over there near Duncan and Son. And Marilyn spoke up and said, and the old post office that was on the corner of Main Street. Yep, Loretta said, I remember that too. And here's one that I don't remember. I car hopped, is what Inez Matura said, at Epps Cafe along with my sister Elizabeth. I was going to school after and before my shifts at the cafe. And I guess I'm just not quite old enough to remember the car hopping, but obviously Inez does. And then there's Wayne Marcella, the guy I couldn't knock out of the way in the football practice we would have. He was like hitting a brick wall. Anyhow, Wayne spoke up and said, Senior Bridge. He hadn't heard about Senior Bridge since he left Eagle Lake. And then Diane Morgan said, Wayne Marcella. They replaced the concrete, by the way, where we used to paint. And then after I saw you at the garage sale, I remembered that Henry Marcella was in our class. And then there's Linda Johnson. Linda Johnson is all grins and gives hearts and plugs because she loved the podcast. And then Gail Austin said, growing up in a small town was a blessing. Marilyn then said, I wonder how many layers of paint are actually on that bridge. Then Wayne is getting excited because he's listening to the podcast and seeing all the people's messages, and he says, why can't we get an Eagle Lake High School reunion downtown and have food trucks brought in and food booths and lots of good old friends? Let's do this. So, if all you out there listening, get a hold of Wayne and ask him to be the chairman of this reunion, and let's get it done, right? And then Marilyn Morgan. I'm in, Wayne, I'm in. Even though I didn't graduate from ELHS, I attended throughout my junior year. I was in the first graduating class at Rice High School, but still considers myself an Eagle Lake High School Eagle. And Pam Birch. Now, I don't know how many of you remember Pam Birch. I bet a bunch of you do, but you don't remember her as Pam Birch. You remember her as Pam Szymanski. And she said, I am enjoying listening to your podcast, Sidney. So many great memories. Oh, and then another classmate of mine has an older sister. I think she was in my brother Daryl's class, and her name is Carol Elaine Dye. Of course, she's married now and carries the last name Klassen, but she lives in California, where she has been ever since she turned 25 years old. And she says, Sidney, this podcast means so much to me, so thank you and the whole team. And then Inez, I was a car hop at Epps. And then Loretta Kretschmeyer. And the talent shows in the school auditorium. How many remember that? And watching movies in the auditorium when the theater burned down. Or walking from the old high school to the new elementary school with all of our books in a brown paper bag. I'm fortunate to have one of the new elementary chairs from the 2nd grade. At least that's what's on the bottom. And the Halloween pranks at the high school. Oh, Loretta says I could go on and on. And then she says, and the Rice basketball tournament. Then Marilyn Morgan says, oh yes, the Rice tournament was great. We waited for it all year. That old gym at the high school was a disaster. The new gym was wonderful, and I still call it the new gym. But many of us wouldn't call the old gym a disaster because back in the 1940s and the 50s and the 60s, Sonny Spaniel, Clyde Brown, and my father Elmer Struess were the referees for the basketball tournament, the Rice basketball tournament, which was probably one of the biggest tournaments along the entire Gulf Coast, and it was held in that gym. And during World War II, that gym was used for dances and whatnot. Oh, it had a great history till it had to come down. And then Loretta Kretschmeyer was telling Inez in one of her comments that she remembers the day that she walked to the new school. And Rosie Burke's sister, Mary Ann Burke, she says, "My sister Elizabeth and I used to ride our horses over to Senior Bridge and see the latest editions." How many remember Mary Ann? They lived on Lakeside Drive, just as you head out to Gary Waddell, David Willis, and William Bruner, and Davis Waddell. Yep, lots and lots of good friends made comments on this website. So there's so many memories, and I really hope a lot of you like those memories. Well, that's it for me. I gotta go now, but before I do, let me say that my newest novel is almost off the press after 9 months. It's called Destiny Waits, Murder in the Prairie Edge Museum. It's a love story and a murder mystery wrapped up into one in the late 1960s at Eagle Lake Small Town Museum. Follow the twist, follow the turns, and try to guess who done it, which you won't find out until the truth is told in the last 20 pages. And for you women out there, do you remember Helen Reddy? Did you hear her roar? Did you know she was invincible? My best-selling 2 novels out of 50 books, I Am Woman, Hear Me Roar, and I Am Woman, I Am Invincible, both a romance novel of 4 best girlfriends who graduate from college during the Civil War, and each having to choose the North or the South because of the man that they fall in love with. Give them both a try. And now, I'm going to ask you one final question. How many remember your class song? Now, I don't remember the song, the class song of the class that graduated before us, and neither do I remember the song of the class that graduated after us. But I do remember, as I close my eyes for just a moment and see all of our graduation class standing in our black robes with the orange and black tassel hanging off our hats as they announced that the class would sing their class song.
Sergeant Carter, I got my voice back. I can sing.
Your voice is back. Are you sure, pal? Are you sure?
Well, of course, you heard what I just sang.
Yeah, that's right. Hey, you're supposed to go on. Come on. Excuse me, please.
Now, ladies and gentlemen, if you'll look at your programs, you'll see that our next performer is Marine Private First Class Gomer Pyle. However, and so, ladies and gentlemen, I am proud to present Marine Private First Class Gomer Pyle.
Impossible dream, to fight the unbeatable foe, to bear with unbearable sorrow, to run where the brave dare not go, right the unrightable wrong. Chased from afar,
And to all my listeners out there, and especially to my class of 1968, thank you for joining me today on this podcast and our theme song from that class, The Impossible Dream. Again, see you later, alligator. Well, that does it for me for another great episode from Sidney St. James. Be sure to click on the tab above that says send a voice message, and I will get it from you, and I'll probably play it back on one of my future podcasts. Also, don't forget to click the button follow. I'd love for you to follow my podcast. But it's been fun. I hope you enjoyed this episode. And until next time, here I am, Sidney St. James. Happy listening.